If you ask a principal what keeps their school from collapsing, they will almost always point to the obvious stuff,
Oh,
right?
right, the visible infrastructure.
Exactly. They will show you the state budget or, the physical red brick buildings, the lined up yellow buses, the standardized curriculum.
The things you can easily measure.
Yeah, the smart boards and all of that. But we are looking at a new document today from a clinical organization in Georgia, and it is arguing that the real load-bearing walls of the education system, they are not made of brick or taxpayer money at all.
Not even close.
No. They are made of exhausted grandmothers, single moms, and aunties. So, welcome to this deep dive. Today we have a single, frankly fascinating document on the table.
It really is a unique text.
It's from an organization called MentalSpace School, which provides K-12 mental health support for schools all across Georgia. And the mission for our deep dive today is to explore the hidden architecture of student well-being.
Right, by looking at two very different halves of the exact same coin.
Exactly, because this document is essentially a dual-purpose text. It's part clinical outline and part Mother's Day tribute, actually.
Which is a profound shift in perspective to look at education this way. What makes this text so compelling is that it forces us to hold two completely different realities in our minds at the exact same time.
Yeah, the institutional and the personal.
Right. First, we have the rigid, logistical, institutional frameworks of clinical mental health support. So the data, the compliance deadlines, the insurance billing codes.
All the heavily regulated stuff.
Yes. But then the text pivots dramatically to examine the deeply personal, quiet, and honestly entirely uncompensated labor of the families that actually keep these K-12 schools standing in the first place.
And we are going to look at both. Because to truly understand the modern education system and, well, modern childhood itself, you really cannot ignore one and hope to understand the other.
Definitely not. You have to see the whole picture.
So let's unpack the clinical institutional side first, because the ecosystem MentalSpace School is setting up here is, it's massive.
It's very comprehensive.
According to the document, their K-12 mental health support includes same-day teletherapy, dedicated therapist teams assigned per school, crisis intervention, suicide and violence prevention, and, this is interesting, staff wellness programs and family counseling.
Let's contextualize why a list like that is such a massive departure from the historical norm, though.
Yeah, please do.
Because if you look at the traditional model of K-12 mental health over, say, the last few decades, the entire infrastructure typically relied on a single, completely overwhelmed guidance counselor.
Oh, man, yeah, like one counselor for 500 kids.
Exactly. One counselor responsible for hundreds of students. If a student acted out or had a panic attack, they got a referral, and then they were just placed on a waiting list to see an external specialist.
And that takes, what, weeks?
3 to 6 weeks, usually,
Yeah.
sometimes more. And during those weeks of waiting, the crisis almost inevitably deepens. It solidifies into a disciplinary issue or, chronic absenteeism.
Which is why this same-day teletherapy component feels like an entirely different paradigm. It's an immediate triage model rather than a wait list model.
Precisely. They're intercepting the crisis the moment it happens.
Right, before it spirals into something that requires an out-of-school suspension or worse, hospitalization. It's like an always-open digital guidance counselor's office on steroids.
That's a great way to put it. It changes the fundamental trajectory of a student's entire academic year. But we also need to look at the scope of the ecosystem they are defining here.
You mean beyond just the students?
Yeah.
Notice that they do not just list services for the individual child, they explicitly include staff wellness and family counseling.
Right.
They are recognizing a core truth of clinical psychology, which is that a child's mental health does not exist in a vacuum.
I actually have an analogy for this.
Oh, let's hear it.
It is like trying to upgrade the software on a computer while completely ignoring the fact that the motherboard is overheating.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that fits perfectly. Right. Like treating just the individual student for 45 minutes and then dropping them right back into a chaotic environment. That is the software update. Providing staff wellness and family counseling is cooling down the motherboard so the system can actually function.
That is the exact mechanism at play. Because you cannot effectively treat a student in isolation and then return them to an untreated, highly stressed environment.
It just undoes the work.
Exactly. If the teacher in the classroom is completely burned out and operating on a hair trigger, or if the family dynamic at home is in a state of severe crisis, The individual therapy the student receives will be instantly neutralized.
So you have to treat the entire ecosystem around the child to see any kind of sustainable long-term
You
change.
do. It's the only way it works.
But, having a great theory about treating an ecosystem is one thing on paper. Making it actually accessible and effective on the ground is an entirely different challenge.
Oh, logistics are everything.
Which naturally brings us to the data in this document. Because the text lists some highly specific outcome metrics here. They claim an 89% improved attendance rate, a 92% reduced anxiety rate, and an 85% family satisfaction rate.
Those are strong numbers.
They are. But wait, let's unpack this for a second. I am really stuck on this 89% attendance statistic.
The jump in attendance.
Yeah. I mean, I understand a 92% reduction in anxiety. That is the direct expected clinical outcome of crisis intervention and therapy. But if a kid is, terrified of the physical classroom, how exactly does talking to a therapist on a screen at home magically get them back into a brick-and-mortar hallway? I feel like I'm missing the bridge here.
It is a super common point of confusion, honestly.
Yeah.
Because we tend to view absenteeism simply as a behavioral choice.
Like the kid is just skipping school to rebel.
Right. We assume they just don't want to go.
Right.
But there is a profound, undeniable link between school avoidance and untreated severe anxiety.
Okay, how so?
When a student is dealing with clinical anxiety, the physical symptoms are incredibly real. We were talking about severe stomach aches, morning panic attacks, and an overwhelming physiological dread of social interaction or academic pressure.
It's not just in their head, it's in their body.
Exactly. The autonomic nervous system is literally treating the physical classroom as a life-threatening trigger, so they stay home.
And the school just codes that as a truancy issue?
Yes, they view it as a disciplinary problem. But fundamentally, it is a psychological friction problem. So to answer your question about the bridge,
Yeah, how do they get back in the building?
the teletherapy session does not magically teleport them. What it does is provide immediate coping strategies, exposure techniques, and a reduction in the baseline arousal of their nervous system.
Oh, I see.
By treating the anxiety in a safe space, which is usually their own home, via teletherapy, you lower the perceived threat level. Once the psychological friction is reduced, the physical barrier to entry just dissolves.
Because they aren't panicking at the thought of the front door?
Exactly. The attendance improves because stepping into the building is no longer triggering a massive fight-or-flight response.
You are dismantling the invisible wall, keeping them out.
Perfectly said.
But, dismantling that wall requires the student to actually get into the therapy session in the first place, which historically is incredibly difficult for a lot of families.
The barriers to entry are huge.
Huge. But the logistics MentalSpace outlines here to get kids in front of those therapists are pretty aggressive. The business side of this document highlights that Medicaid costs $0 for the families.
That's a game changer right there.
And looking at their coverage, it is not a short list. They accept a massive range of insurances.
They aren't just taking premium private insurance, right? They are explicitly integrating state-level safety nets.
Yeah. The document lists Blue Cross, Blue Shield, Cigna, Aetna, United Healthcare, Humana, but then also Peach State, CareSource, and Amerigroup. They are blanketing the entire socioeconomic spectrum.
Because achieving those high outcome numbers, like that 89% improved attendance, is mathematically impossible unless you completely remove the friction at the point of entry.
You have to make it easy to start.
Right. In the United States, the single greatest barrier to mental health care is financial and administrative complexity.
The paperwork alone is a nightmare.
It is. If a family is already managing a child in the middle of a mental health crisis, and a school counselor hands them a complex out-of-network billing process with a sky-high deductible, that family will simply opt out.
They just don't have the energy for it.
They do not have the cognitive or financial bandwidth to navigate it. By ensuring Medicaid is $0 out of pocket, and by accepting virtually every major insurance plan operating in Georgia, MentalSpace is removing that financial barrier entirely.
True access means a family never has to choose between, crisis intervention for their child and buying groceries for the week. Financial barriers are only one part of the equation, though. The document also explicitly notes that they utilize licensed, diverse, and culturally competent therapists.
And that is just as critical as the insurance coverage.
Because it removes the cultural friction.
Yes. Think about it. If a student finally logs on to a same-day therapy session, but the therapist cannot understand or respect the cultural nuances of, say, a multi-generational household.
Or they just completely misread the situation.
Right. If they misinterpret a specific family dynamic based on their own cultural blind spots, The therapeutic alliance fails before it even really begins. Cultural competence is what actually keeps the student logging back in for session 2.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, the document backs all this clinical work up with a heavy layer of compliance. They note they are fully HIPAA and FERPA compliant to protect patient privacy and student records.
Which is non-negotiable for schools.
Right, but there is a specific legislative detail here that I want to highlight. They specifically offer HB 268 compliance support ahead of a July 2026 deadline, and it's framed as a major selling point.
Oh, for any school administrator, that detail is the equivalent of throwing a life preserver to a drowning person.
Wait, really? Is it that big of a deal?
Oh, absolutely. HEP 268 is not just a polite suggestion from the state of Georgia. It is a strict legislative mandate that legally requires schools to track, monitor, and report specific mental health interventions and safety protocols.
Oh, wow. So it is an active, ongoing reporting requirement, not just a set of guidelines.
Precisely. And if a school does not have a secure, compliant, and modernized system to log these interventions, they face severe administrative penalties.
That sounds incredibly stressful for a principal.
It is. State mandates around mental health reporting are becoming increasingly rigorous, which, is good for student safety. But for a school principal or a district superintendent, a looming deadline like July 2026 to implement a complex tracking system from scratch.
Yeah.
It is a source of pure institutional panic.
So MentalSpace is essentially offering to just absorb the liability and the paperwork for them.
Yes. By providing that HB 268 compliance support, MentalSpace is stating that they aren't just treating the students on the clinical side, they are relieving a massive structural administrative burden from the school leadership on the back end.
Well, for any administrators listening who are actively sweating over that July 2026 deadline right now, the document does provide direct contact info to get that compliance infrastructure set up. It's mentalspaceschool.com, or they can be reached via email at mentalspaceschool@sheaththerapy.com.
Good to know.
But, even with the most flawless compliance dashboard and the most robust insurance coverage, none of this functions if the student never actually logs onto the iPad. Which brings us to the second half of this document, and the pivot here is really striking.
The 85% family satisfaction metric you mentioned earlier is actually the perfect bridge for this transition.
It really is, because we just spent the last few minutes analyzing HIPAA, FERPA, Medicaid networks, and state legislative mandates. Very dry institutional stuff.
Very clean.
But the second half of this source material was published on a very specific day, which was Mother's Day, and it operates as a deeply personal tribute.
It's quite moving, actually.
I'm going to read the specific list of who MentalSpace is thanking in this tribute, because the level of detail is highly intentional here.
Go for it.
They speak directly to, quote, the single mom holding it down, the working mom who made it to the school program even though her week was impossible, the grandmother raising grandchildren, the stepmom who chose love every single day, the aunties and the foster moms, and every woman who has poured strength into a child she calls her own.
It is a stunning departure from clinical corporate speak.
It really is. Returning to my earlier thought about how we view school infrastructure, it is like looking at the blueprints of a massive building, right?
Right.
We usually only discuss the obvious load-bearing walls. We talk about the teachers, the principals, the state funding. But this text is explicitly drawing our attention to the aunties, the stepmoms, the grandmothers.
The people actually doing the heavy lifting at home.
Exactly. It is pointing to the hidden underground foundation that actually prevents the entire structure from sinking into the ground.
And what really demands analysis here is the expansiveness of that list.
How do you mean?
Well, this clinical document is purposefully redefining the traditional nuclear concept of a mother. They are not just issuing a generic, pastel-colored Happy Mother's Day to all the moms.
Right, it's very specific.
They're being highly specific because they're reflecting the actual on-the-ground reality of who is raising Georgia's students today. When a clinical organization acknowledges the grandmother raising grandchildren or the aunties or the foster moms, they are validating non-traditional family structures.
They're saying these structures are equally vital.
Exactly. They're structurally vital to a child's academic and psychological success.
I am particularly struck by the phrase, every woman who has poured strength into a child she calls her own. It completely removes biology from the equation.
It does.
It defines motherhood not as a biological status, but as an action. It is a daily, exhausting choice to provide care.
It treats motherhood as an active verb. And consider the specific image they use. The working mom who made it to the school program even though her week was impossible.
That is so relatable for so many people.
because that is not a sanitized, perfect view of parenting. It acknowledges the intense grinding friction between systemic economic demands like the impossible work week, the long commute, paying the
Yeah,
bills,
the real world stress.
right, and the deeply personal, desperate desire to show up for a child's emotional milestones. By naming that struggle, they are validating the immense, completely uncompensated emotional labor required just to maintain a baseline of normalcy for a student before they even walk into a classroom.
And this deep recognition of diverse, struggling family structures leads us directly to the ultimate thesis of this source text. It brings the clinical half and the emotional half of the document crashing together.
It really unites the whole piece.
The concluding lines state that MentalSpace sees all of you. They write that the strength these women bring ripples through every classroom in Georgia. And then they say, thank you for the love, the labor, and the strength that holds entire schools together quietly.
Holds entire schools together quietly. That is the pivotal phrase of this entire deep dive.
I really have to point out what an incredible admission this is. I mean, we are reading a document from a company that is actively selling a comprehensive institutional mental health support system to school districts.
They are trying to get schools to buy their service.
Right. They are marketing teletherapy, crisis intervention, and legislative compliance software. Yet, in their own promotional document, they are outright stating that it is the maternal figures who are quietly holding entire schools together.
It's wild.
They're essentially saying, our clinical product is fantastic, but you, the grandmothers and the aunties, are the actual glue.
It is a remarkably honest positioning, honestly. And it actively rejects the standard corporate savior narrative.
What do you mean by that?
Well, they're not claiming that simply buying their teletherapy software magically fixes a broken community.
Right. They aren't pretending the iPad is going to raise the kid.
Exactly the opposite. It posits the partnership model. The text is acknowledging that the invisible, quiet, emotional labor of maternal figures is the primary irreplaceable glue of the education system.
Without it, things fall apart.
Totally. Without the grandmother waking the student up and managing their anxiety at the breakfast table, without the foster mom navigating complex trauma triggers at home, without the working mom pushing through an impossible week just to enforce a routine, the school system would completely fracture.
It would collapse.
No amount of teletherapy can replace that human foundation.
So wait, what is the role of the clinical side then, if the moms are the foundation?
MentalSpace exists to provide the professional clinical scaffolding around that foundation. Think of it as heavy artillery or, professional backup.
Okay, I see.
These women are carrying the daily emotional weight of these students. But when a student hits a true, acute mental health crisis like severe clinical anxiety, suicidal ideation, or the aftermath of violence, that is a weight no parent, grandmother, or auntie should ever have to carry alone.
It's too much for one person.
Way too much.
Yeah.
The same-day teletherapy, the culturally competent clinical teams, the $0 Medicaid options. These exist so that the hidden foundation of the school does not crack under an impossible pressure.
It is providing professional institutional reinforcements to the people doing the quiet, everyday labor.
Exactly.
They are the clinical reinforcements for the emotional frontline. When you view it that way, it is a fascinating blueprint for how massive institutions and local communities can actually interact without one trying to erase or replace the other.
It's a true partnership.
Let's look back at the territory we have covered today, because we've gone through a lot. We started by examining the rigid, necessary logistics of providing K-12 institutional mental health support across Georgia.
Right, the clinical side.
We looked at how immediate triage disrupts the old waitlist model, the barrier-breaking power of integrating state safety nets alongside $0 Medicaid, and, of course, the administrative relief of handling complex HB 268 compliance mandates.
We examined the visible architecture of care that schools are legally and morally required to build.
But then we traced all of those impressive clinical outcomes, like the 89% improved attendance, the 92% reduced anxiety, all the way back to their roots.
Back to the homes.
Yeah, I followed the data right past the school doors, past the teletherapy screens, and into the living rooms of the single moms, the grandmothers, and the foster moms. We found the quiet, daily, uncompensated labor that actually keeps the whole system functioning.
Because the clinical outcomes rely entirely on the structural integrity of that home foundation. The software update fails if the hardware is completely broken.
Exactly. Which brings us back to you listening to this right now. As we have unpacked this dual reality of visible institutional systems and invisible maternal labor, I really want you to reflect on your own community.
It's an important thing to think about.
Who are the invisible pillars in your life? Who are the people holding things together quietly during those, quote, impossible weeks? And more importantly, how can we better support them? Whether through institutional tools like the clinical networks we discussed today, or just through a fundamental shift in how we acknowledge their labor.
And, that leads to a much larger and honestly somewhat uncomfortable question that this text provokes.
Oh, what's that?
Well, we have established through this clinical organization's own admission that the quiet, uncompensated emotional labor of maternal figures is literally what holds entire schools together. It is the foundation of the system.
It is the glue.
So, if that is empirically true, it makes you wonder, if private corporate entities like MentalSpace are now having to write compliance software and provide clinical scaffolding just to prop up the invisible labor of exhausted mothers,
Yeah.
at what point does the actual state recognize that they have entirely outsourced the foundation of public education to the private sector and unpaid families? What would happen to our educational infrastructure if we stopped treating that labor as an invisible assumption and instead began treating it as the most critical, highly valued asset in our entire society?
Man, that is a staggering paradigm shift because right now we stare at the red bricks, the linoleum hallways, and the state budgets, and we think that is the school.
We think that's the whole
We
picture.
forget to look at the invisible, uncompensated foundation underneath it all. And as we have explored today, if you aren't supporting that hidden foundation, the bricks really do not stand a chance. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We will catch you next time.